One of the main important things about the eastern slopes is that it is our headwaters. Those snow-capped peaks, they're basically our water towers. Upwards of 90% of the water that we're getting in a lot of our channels is coming down from those mountains. So that's critically important. We use that for drinking water. It's critical for habitat. There's a lot of activities that are happening on this landscape. Because it's so beautiful, people come out here to recreate. We also use it for resource extraction. Things like coal and oil and gas, this is where a lot of our forestry is. So I think definitely with that cumulative pressure on the landscape, balanced with the critical habitat and the sensitivity of our source water, I think that's why we're really trying to promote stewardship of these areas. Cows and fish, we sort of have a couple different approaches when we're working on the landscape. And the one is very much proactive in that, we will work with a land user or a land manager. We use what we call our riparian health assessment. So we'll actually go out onto a landscape and we're looking at a few different indicators to tell us whether an area is healthy or not. And then on the other hand, we have some more reactive situations, such as when we're doing restoration, where an area has been compromised. And so we're coming back in and then we're replanting the willows to try to gain that ecological value again.
To promote safe riding be our main goal, and to promote awareness on environmental damage that OHVs can cause. Also to learn a love of the forestry, a love of the land, and an appreciation of all that we have out in this great area that we live in and are fortunate enough to recreate in.
Gary Clark, I'm the president of the Coast Espace Spotsman.
The types of conservation work that we've done in the past, of course, bridges is our main focus. We've also done riparian work along the riverbanks, again, with cows and fish, and also WC as well. The number one reason that we do the bridges over the waterways is to protect the fish habitat. When OHVs cross waterways, for example, they tend to put silt into the stream, and the silt goes down and will fill in the pools where the fish are. It covers up the plants that the fish eat and food that the fish eat. The work that we do, we feel, is extremely important, not only to teach other people how to ride sensibly and follow examples of Quad Squad members, to stay on the designated trails, not to go off the trails, not to play in the water, definitely, and not to cross water if there's a bridge available.
This stream, Sylvester in particular, one of the reasons that it was also an area of concern is that there's the West Slope cutthroat trout that actually live in this stream. So it kind of makes it a little bit higher priority because West Slope cutthroat trout have so few areas left. Like the eastern slopes is kind of the last refuge for a lot of trout species in general. So here we have a bunch of willow stakes, and by planting the willow stakes, we're helping enhance the vegetation, so getting those roots in the ground so that they can start to filter again and start to store water again. Roots will act like fingers and they can kind of hold all of that soil together on the bank and prevent slumping. So riparian areas are really important for fish habitat. They provide several different functions that benefit fish. Usually diverse levels of vegetation, so you got tall willows, you have smaller shrubs like sedges and rushes, so it's diversity of habitat. Having that tall vegetation provides shading over the creek, which can help cool the creek. It also, all that vegetation slows down the water running across the landscape, and so that all of that, any contaminants, sediments, things like that can filter out before the water actually gets into the creek. So filtering is a really important part. This Sylvester Creek here eventually flows into the Elbow, which then flows into the Bow, and that provides drinking water for the city of Calgary and everywhere downstream.
Good evening and welcome to our online session of the Native Trout Workshop. This is the first session we'll be hosting for this workshop. We have another one next week, which is in person, March 21st, from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. at Chain Lakes. There's only a few tickets left for that event, so if you really wanted to come, make sure you find those tickets on the Cows and Fish Eventbrite page. My name is Amy Burlando, formerly Amy McLeod, for those of you that knew me as that. I'm here on behalf of Cows and Fish, and I will be your host for this evening. Tonight, I'm joining you from Mohkinstsis, Calgary, Alberta, and I honor and acknowledge that I live on Treaty 7 land, which is the ancestral lands of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Siksika, Kainai, and Piikani, shared with the Tsuut'ina and Stoney Nakoda, and Métis Nation of Alberta. There are many others joining from across Alberta and even outside of Alberta. So please take a moment to acknowledge the land and the history of the land that you are on. The long relationship between Indigenous people and this land includes a deep knowledge and respect for living and non-living entities that create the amazing place that we call home. Recognizing the knowledge of Indigenous communities who have stewarded these lands is an important step on our journey of reconciliation. Repairing our relationship to the natural world through practicing gratitude for the gifts that this land provides, and reciprocity, utilizing our own gifts to give back to the land, is also another step. I hope that the information from this session tonight helps you along this journey. A few technical things before we get started. We have 3 presentations tonight, after which we will have the presenters available to take questions. So if you have a question, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and be sure to check back and vote up questions that you want to make sure get answered. You're welcome to leave comments as well in the chat box, but please be respectful. We will be giving away prizes for participants, so all attendees will be automatically added to a draw with bonus entries for those that ask questions in the Q&A box. Prizes include tickets to the outdoor show, Patagonia fish-themed ball cap, and a Patagonia travel rod roll, 2 pairs of tickets to the Bow Habitat Station, and hats and a sticker pack from Alberta Native Trout Collaborative. We will email the winners, and thanks to all of the donors for those fabulous prizes. And so before we dive in any further tonight, I'd like to thank you all for attending and to get to know you a little bit better. So I'm going to ask one of my co-hosts to please launch the poll. And if you could take a minute to fill it out and tell us what sector you represent. So feel free to use the chat if you want to include even more information, like where you're from, what lands you're tuning in from, and what interests you in attending today. As you do that, I will take a moment to thank our funders and collaborators. So thank you to DFO and the Alberta government as funders for this workshop. And in addition to these funders, many organizations and groups provided input and contributed to the workshop. So the Native Trout Collaborative, the Old Man Watershed Council, the Elbow River Watershed Partnership, and the Ghost Watershed Alliance Society. And finally, a big thank you to our amazing speakers for helping us out tonight. So as I mentioned, I am with Cows and Fish, otherwise known as the Riparian Management Society. And Cows and Fish is a not-for-profit that empowers people to take actions to care for riparian areas, those areas that connect land and water. I often get asked about what cows have to do with fish. The answer is in understanding relationships. In this case, the relationship between cattle and their impact on the landscape and how that impacts fish and in general water. But it isn't just the relationship between cows and fish. There are many different human activities that impact our land and, as a result, the water. So fish aren't just a product of the water that they live in. They are a product of the entire watershed, which includes the land and us. And no matter where you are on the landscape, we are all part of the watershed. From the headwaters to our taps, all of the activities that we do add up to impact the health of our water. Cows and Fish recognizes that as all things are connected by water, we need to work together to find solutions that benefit us all. And it isn't just livestock management. With appropriate management and care, we can have healthy, productive landscapes that don't cause our watersheds to unravel, negatively impacting our finned kin. Riparian areas, those green threads along the water's edge, sew the land, water, and people together. Healthy riparian areas are critical for providing the clean, cold, connected, and complex waterways that native trout require. So when I refer to Alberta's native trout species, I'm referring to the Athabasca rainbow, Alberta's provincial fish, the bull trout, and West Slope cutthroat trout, all of which are listed provincially and federally as threatened. Native trout and their habitats in the beautiful Rocky Mountains are a part of our history and identity as Albertans. These fish, once abundant in Alberta, are now confined to the eastern slopes where these headwater streams are their last stronghold. This is a picture from 1902, and it showcases a day's catch of West Slope cutthroat trout in Trout Creek, which is in the Porcupine Hills. Currently, you cannot find them there anymore. Native trout were here long before Alberta became a province and long before settlement. So what happened? We happened. Native trout and their habitats are currently being threatened by human land use pressures such as industry, development, recreation, forestry, grazing, with other additive pressures such as angling pressure, invasive species, disease, competition, hybridization, and climate change, just to name a few. Not only are native trout our neighbors, but they are also indicators of the water they live in and the land that surrounds that water. So if we look to native trout species to gauge our impact on the land and water, what might they tell us? Have we been good stewards of this shared space? With cumulative land use pressures, it can be overwhelming to know where to focus recovery efforts. And so recognizing the challenges presented with native trout recovery in the face of all these cumulative effects, in 2019, the Native Trout Collaborative was formed. This was initiated by the Alberta Environment and Protected Areas, guided by their species at risk recovery plans, and funded through DFO. So organizations like the one shown here that were working on different aspects of native trout recovery came together to align, coordinate, and leverage resources between our programs. Our work maintaining and enhancing riparian habitats is part of that effort, but there are other pieces that go into recovering native trout species. This workshop is part of our ongoing commitment to support native trout recovery, and we are happy to announce that this is the 13th annual workshop we have hosted. Thank you to all the people that have supported this work along the way. Many small changes can have big results. To learn more about how to get involved in native trout recovery, visit albertanativetrout.com. Together, our actions can make a difference. So a key principle that underlies the success of the Cows and Fish program, but also recovery efforts in general for native trout, is that decisions and actions of the people on the landscape will determine watershed health. So if we can see ourselves as active participants within a system, or in this case, a problem, and understand the dynamics of how that system works, then we may be empowered towards solutions. So we can move from awareness, seeing that there is an issue, to cultivating ethic, caring enough to want to change it, and motivating action, actually doing something about it. And so without further ado, we have an excellent agenda for you this evening, covering all three of those elements of stewardship: knowledge, ethic, and action. And first up will be Dr. Benjamin Kissinger, who will be speaking on the knowledge piece. And Ben is with he's the Water and Fish Program Lead at FRI Research and an Adjunct Assistant Professor at the University of Calgary. Dr. Kissinger has worked on fisheries research throughout the US and Canada within federal, provincial, and state governments, academia, and industry. His research has taken him from as far east as the Adirondack Mountains to recover brook trout that had been extirpated by lake acidification, to Alaska and the West, where he worked in hatcheries that diverted commercial salmon harvest to artificially propagated populations. The vast majority of his work to date has been related to applied fisheries management, research, and recovery associated with government initiatives. Recently, he worked for Alberta Environment and Parks as a biologist based in Grand Prairie, giving him an intimate knowledge of northwestern Alberta through his fieldwork and recreation. His recent research interests have been focused on understanding hybridization extent between native and non-native salmonids using genomic tools, understanding changes in non-native species, such as brook trout, occupancy over time through the use of dynamic occupancy models, and investigating the relationship between species presence and temperature, which he will talk about today. So feel free to share your screen, Ben, and welcome, and thank you for joining us. We're excited for what you have to share this evening.
Sounds good. Well, thanks everyone for the invite. Amy did an awesome job with the intro for the reason why we're here today. So thank you, Amy. I'll be talking about a collaborative approach to modeling stream temperature along Alberta's eastern slopes. And I just want to, Amy did an awesome introduction on the land acknowledgement. I want to add that my research spans the east slope, so I work in Treaties 6 and 8 as well, which is home to many Indigenous communities as well as the Métis Nation of Alberta. On top of that, I've collaborated and worked with a variety of people to accomplish this work. The work was initiated by Dr. Barry White, who is now the Executive Director of FRI Research. He brought in a lot of grants associated with getting this work done. Mac Hydro is a consultant company that's doing the modeling component of our work and is led by Dr. Ryan McDonald. Lisa Schabel with Alberta Environment Protected Areas has helped with a ton of logistics, gear, and access to past data that's been collected. And Dr. Neil McNotch at the Department of Fisheries and Oceans and his contractor, Dan Telecki, have been validating some of the models that we've done in the East Slopes. This work was actually initiated by Wes Fraser out of the Sundre area. And the very first versions of these models were actually conducted there. And then data has been submitted by a variety of different agencies, and funding for this work has come both from the Department of Fisheries and Oceans as well as FRIA. So to provide a little bit of a background about why water is important. Water is important because it influences fish growth and energetics. And I have a very complex energetic diagram here, but it's actually not that complex. Basically, food goes in. There are costs within the fish's body. Waste products get excreted, and not everything can be digested and consumed. And the remaining goes to growth and reproduction. And with fish, because they are exotherms, meaning that the environment surrounding them influences all their body processes as well as their body temperature, what water temperature they're in highly influences how effective they are at growing or putting resources to reproduction, even to the point that if they get to suboptimal conditions, they could die. So this diagram here shows roughly how fish, and in this particular situation, bull trout, grow at different temperatures. So we have the amount of growth on the y-axis here, so less and more, as well as temperature on the x-axis. And what we see is that at cold temperatures and warm temperatures, growth decreases within bull trout, and at some range in between approximately 10 and 16 and a half is ideally optimal temperatures for growth for this particular species. So if we think about that, that shapes where bull trout, and any native trout can exist on the landscape. So because water plays such an important role with where fish can be, you got to ask yourself, what influences water temperature? Water temperature is influenced by atmospheric exchange, so basically what air temperature is like in a given area, solar radiation, amount of forest cover, as well as cold water inputs like groundwater, glacial inputs, snow melt, and hypereic exchange. And how much of that occurs in each stream or tributary influences how sensitive that particular stream or tributary is to warming climate or landscape changes. So how do we measure that? Basically, because air temperature isn't a perfect surrogate for what the water temperature is going to be, we actually have to go out and put small probes in the water that record temperature continuously over the summer months. And we try and focus in on August because it's typically the time of year with the lowest amount of flow and warmest water temperatures. So in the figure that I'm showing here, we have temperature on the y-axis and time on the x-axis, and we have a warm river in red and a cold river in blue. And what these loggers tell us is in the warm river, we see a lot of daily variation, big ups and downs within that river. Whereas in the cooler one, there's less. So there's likely some type of cold water input that's minimizing change in this given system. And for these reasons, we see that in August, the blue river is actually cooler than the red one. So when we overlay the optimal temperatures for bull trout on that, we see that the warm one pushes above those optimal temperatures throughout the course of the summer and sometimes even on a daily basis. So the blue stream, the cooler one, would be better for bull trout. Temperature also varies annually. So if we went for a dip in the river right now, most streams would be quite cold, whereas in the summer, it warms up. And for these reasons, it could shape movement patterns in fish on an annual basis, from warmer or colder environments to those within their optimal range. So when we think about those variables that influence water temperature at a given location or within a given watershed, it can shape where those species exist in the watershed. So here, hypothetically, this entire watershed is available to bull trout. But as we know, there's upper extents that could occur just naturally by shallow water. If there isn't water, fish can't exist there. Or there can be physical barriers like waterfalls that can influence fish movement. Similarly, on the downstream end, if we get warming temperatures, it can constrict the amount of available habitat for cold water species. And if they have no place to go upstream, it just keeps compressing where they can exist. So from a fisheries manager standpoint, understanding where optimal habitat is for cold water species is really important, especially for the 3 species that are currently listed. It's also important to understand which watersheds have the most available optimal habitat or thermal habitat, as well as which watersheds are likely most vulnerable to change or loss of that habitat with climate change predictions. And so these models can help answer a lot of those questions, and they can help shape recovery actions. I believe, like any for native trout, should consider what the temperature is currently and into the future. So I believe all of them would benefit from this information. It helps with identifying critical habitat for these cold water species, and can play an influence in industrial activities to help encourage either changes in practice or policy and regulation. I'm not reinventing the wheel here. This is an approach that's been done before. Our counterparts in the US have been doing this for over a decade. The Norwest group has done a wonderful job of implementing and modeling temperature throughout the lower 48 states in the western half. And if anyone wants more information on this, I highly recommend going to their site. But basically what they've done is they've predicted August temperature, which represents the warmest, lowest flowing month of the year for our cold water fish for the western half of the lower 48. And from this, managers can then make more informed decisions on species recovery actions. To accomplish that, they partnered with a variety of groups. I took this screenshot off their page, and there was 111 different logos on there, indicating at minimum there was 111 different groups that contributed data or supported the modeling process, which is awesome. So to do something similar in Alberta, I've tried to implement a similar approach. The process is somewhat simple, even though the models are quite complex, but really all you need is data and a model. And so FRI Research, who I work for, is basically herding all the data that exists and collecting new data. And as mentioned before, Mac Hydro has produced a model already, and we're just inputting the data in there and assessing its fit. So the steps basically are to assess the current gaps, reach out to stakeholder groups to find out if there's missing data, prioritize and fill any data gaps, and then assess the model fit and rinse and repeat. So for the first step, looking at data gaps and what we currently have, in last spring, we found that the majority of the headwater areas, particularly in national parks, was missing data as well as main stems. And we had approximately 673 unique locations to produce our models from. And that's a good start, but it wasn't enough to get fit like what we were seeing in the US. So we prioritized logger locations in areas that didn't have much data and worked with our national parks counterparts to deploy loggers in that area. They did a great job this past year. I haven't brought the data in yet, but I heard that they had deployed somewhere between 200 and 300 loggers, which is wonderful. I also reached out to groups that I knew had data that hadn't been brought in, and we added that over the past year and QA/QC'd it. Then in areas that had missing data, I basically plotted locations that were road accessible so that we could cover a broad area as quickly as possible, and either contracted people out through grants that we had within FRI, or worked with partners that were willing to volunteer their time to go out and collect data and contribute to this model. And what we got in this last year through our FRI contracts, 376 loggers were deployed along the east slopes. Also found an additional 302 locations that were historic data or data that was collected by other groups on our behalf. And like I said, Parks Canada is going to be bringing some data in soon as well. And on the left-hand side, you can see a map of the area that we added to. This is all new data, so not including the stuff from before. We also linked up with the gauge station data from Alberta Rivers, and that added some data sets in that actually spanned multiple decades, so we can get at some long-term trends in those areas, which is really interesting. And finally, in the next few months, we'll be working together with Mac Hydro again to look at how the model has improved and try and prioritize areas for this coming summer that don't have good fit. So as mentioned, we're still in the QA/QC process. I'm reaching out to any groups that have data. And so if you're on the call and you're like, hey, Ben, I don't think my data made it in yet, please reach out to me afterwards. I have my email on the last slide. And we're reassessing the data gaps, and we look to put out approximately 400 more loggers, if not more, in the coming summer. As mentioned, if you want to get involved in this work, let me know if you have past data, or if you're interested on putting out new data loggers, please reach out and I can help give you some points to let you know where data exists currently and where it doesn't, because that'd really help us finish filling in the map. And that is the end of my talk. I think we're going to leave questions to the very end, but I appreciate your attention.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ben. And absolutely, we set aside some time at the very end for a bit of a panel discussion for all three of the presentations today to field questions. And I've asked that either Maddie or Logan, our helpers, if they can pop your contact information into the chat. So if people have data they want to give you, then they have a way to contact you.
That'd be
So
great.
thank you
Thank you.
so much, Ben. And so next we're going to move on to our ethics portion of the evening. And so I'll invite Dr. Janelle Baker and Dr. Zoe Todd to unmute and to share screen. And they'll be sharing about the Restoring Bull Trout project. And so Janelle is in the Faculty of Anthropology and with the MAIS program at Athabasca University. Her research is in collaboration with First Nations and Métis communities in what is now known as Western Canada regarding their concerns about industrial contamination of their traditional foods. This work involves community-based environmental monitoring to protect food sovereignty of plants, water, and wildlife in the Big Stone Cree Nation territory. She is also part of a team that collaborates with the Stoney Nakoda Nations on restoring bull trout in the eastern slopes of the Rockies and supporting women to measure selenium in traditional foods. And Dr. Zoe Todd is an associate professor of Indigenous Studies and Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Governance and Freshwater Fish Futures at Simon Fraser University. They are Red River Métis and a practice-led artist researcher from Alberta, with parental family connections to the historic St. Paul de Métis settlement through the Todd family. Dr. Todd studies the relationship between Indigenous sovereignty and freshwater fish futures in Canada, and they are co-founder of the Institute for Freshwater Fish Futures, which is a collaborative Indigenous-led initiative that is restoring fish. Welcome. Take it away.
Yeah, so I'm just going to start by giving a bit of background on who we are, what we do, and sort of where this project came from. And yeah, so I'm actually joining the call from Sundre right now. And I grew up on a small beef farm, mixed farm in the area. And my family, I would be 5th generation settler and mixed Métis people from this area. And so it's, I would have never thought I'd live here again, but here I am. And I live right on the border of Treaty 6 and 7 in Sundre. So just on the eastern side of the Red Deer River. I can almost see it from my window here. And yeah, but I became a cultural anthropologist, and so I do ethnographic research. And by ethnographic research, that means that I work with people and try to understand what we might call their cultures or their ways or perspectives of seeing the world. We do this through what we think of as a unique method called participant observation. So it means I literally try to go and hang out with people and do the things that they do and learn those things so that I can experience what it feels like to do certain cultural practices. Yeah, so why would anybody be at a cows and fish workshop talking about ethnographic research and cultural anthropology? But Zoe and I both do anthropology in an environmental perspective. And so we've always really, connected in our work. And Zoe knows that I live in Sundre because as faculty at Athabasca University, I'm able to live anywhere I want in Alberta. And she had said to me, why don't we look at the eastern slopes and do something together? And I was like, sure. And then she had really connections that she'll probably talk about why she wanted to look at bull trout, but I'll tell a little bit of that story now too. Of course, bull trout are actually char, but we became aware of this story about bull trout, as having this mixed tension of being the provincial fish and a beautiful, abundant fish at times, but then also being kind of demonized. So we started looking at records and reading about them and found that bull trout are worse seen as a garbage fish or greedy cannibals, not a sportsman fish, even though they're a native species. And this disdain or this idea that they were a weedy fish informed bad practices, essentially, of people not caring for them well from the settler communities and from conservation and from anglers. Yeah, and so that they were kind of, there were even times when they were culled in an attempt to increase populations of other more interesting fish to fishermen. So, as has been mentioned, their populations are now declining dramatically. So being in the Sundre area, I have kind of, again, old consulting and childhood connections with members of Stoney Nakoda and some of the other First Nations communities whose territory overlaps in this area. But I was able to connect with Bill Snow from Stoney Nakoda Nations. He's the acting director of consultation there. And Bill was eagerly also working on projects around fish and joined our project. And so Stoney Nakoda Nation, they use a method that they call cultural monitoring. This is something that I might call, or like in my introduction, you might hear called community-based monitoring, but it's the idea that culture, it comes first, but that we're looking at environmental knowledge from a cultural perspective first. So as someone participating in this co-production of knowledge for this project, I had the privilege and continue to be required to attend ceremonies and planning meetings. We work with elders. I've gone out to the field with youth. So there's a lot of our work, has the goal of, when elders are sharing, to connect with youth from Stoney Nakoda Nations. Like, we don't want to use our privilege as researchers to just collect elders' knowledge. It's really about that knowledge being available to other community members and youth, and us just helping to support that. So then also we share all of our records. Everything we record or write or do goes back to Bill and to community members. We help write reports with Stoney Nakoda Nation. We do some outreach activities that Zoe will talk about, and some publishing as well. So we also, had some great research assistants and people as a part of our team who really dug into archives, around Dolly Varden, Bull Trout. And I just wanted to have a quick look at a few of the, I have like a minute. I don't want to impose on Zoe's time, but I just wanted to look at a couple of quotes from some of that work. We also did local interviews with community members in the Sundre and greater area. But there's one quote that we found in People in the Peaks of the Panther River and Eastern Slopes, which actually also has sections on some of my family members, the Rainier family. But Jim Hole, a hunter and trapper who traveled and lived in the area, observed the Dolly Varden population, and he said he remembered fishing for Dolly Varden trout, which was something. We had come up the Little Red Deer River after the Stampede week was over. Trout had come out of the Ghost and the dam, and you could catch bagfuls of them. Most were 2.5 to 3 pounds. They would spawn and go up to the Little Red and Harrow Creek. The Stoney Indians used to come from Morley with a team and wagon. They would follow these fish coming up the river. They smoked the fish, hundreds of them, but the fish disappeared. All of a sudden, after the war, there were no more Dolly Varden trout. They just disappeared. We also talked to Kelsey Cure, who was mentioned in the previous slideshow. And I know, again, Kelsey from having grown up around here, and his family is also an older family in this region. And he's a known fisherman, right? And you can see how that informs his work at the sawmill, at the local logging companies, because he involves himself in a lot of the local fish and water projects. But I wanted to just point out that he has shared a lot of incredible local knowledge. But he talks about how there's two kinds of different bull trout. They're in the smaller streams, and then these fluvial migrants. And the interesting thing is, because the red deer is impounded at the Dixon Dam, there's a third kind of variant there. They live in the reservoir all winter, and then they run up the river in the spring. I thought this is such interesting knowledge from someone who lives in that area and fishes the fish. Just one more quick slide is that Bill Snow from Stoney Nakoda had suggested that I look at Mary Schaefer's books, like her old Indian Trails book. She was the first non-Indigenous person to go into the Pinto Lake region. And the interesting thing about her work is that she recorded the place names and, information about Stoney families that were there, whereas the male so-called explorers didn't record any of that kind of information. And so I really enjoy her work now. But she talks about the lake, and she's referring to Pinto Lake here. I'm sure of it from, sort of triangulating her work. And it's famous among the Indians as a fishing ground, and no wonder. The outlet is deep and clear as crystal. And at the time of our visit in September 1906, hundreds of speckled trout could be seen lazily swimming about or lying in the bottoms of the pools, all averaging 14 inches in length. So heavy was our catch that even our bacon-palled appetites refused to devour all we got, and we smoked them, as did the Indians, in a dense smudge of sphagnum moss. So, this historical information is so useful to us, and the stories that people tell around informing our relationships and understanding our stories now with the fish. We've also gone out with various scientists. Christy Sampson is here doing her environmental DNA work on the Bearberry Creek, just north of Sundre, on bull trout. And just to mention that we've also, our team has also published a chapter in a book called Lost Kingdom, also on this work. And I'll hand it over to Zoe. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Janelle, and thank you everyone for inviting us. It's truly an honor to be here tonight. This is like one of the most meaningful invitations I've ever received. It just means so much to get to speak to a group of people I hold in such high esteem. So yeah, I'll just kind of take off where Janelle left off. And so collectively in our work, I, as a Red River Métis scholar, use Indigenous research methodologies. So although I trained in science and also in anthropology, I also look to what diverse Indigenous thinkers here across Canada, but also globally, have sort of like written about and shared with us to give us guidance on how to do work. And so that has led us as a team to using this concept of restoring, which some of you might have heard of, and you can put in the chat like where you've heard of this before if you have. We use it as kind of an approach that is like a play on words between story and restoration. And as people who work across both science and social science and also art and literature and all sorts of different approaches, we find that stories are a really good way of connecting people and that everyone has a fish story in Alberta. Like every sort of interaction we've had, both in our research and outside of our research, when you start to talk about fish, people have stories about either the first fish they caught or a memorable fish they've caught. And so we draw on these concepts of story as method from people like E. Richard Atleo and Joanne Archibald, who are very prominent Indigenous thinkers here on the West Coast where I live. And these approaches have really helped us because we find that working across Indigenous and non-Indigenous contexts, stories are an incredible way of connecting us, and fish are an incredible way of connecting us. So they allow us to work across science and law and ethics and philosophy and art and language and place and time all together. And as a team, we're really interested in how close attention to stories about fish, water, and place in Alberta fosters learning from millennia deep First Nations governance, laws, and protocols with and for fish in the waters the province occupies. So one of the things that also guides us is really to sort of flip the script a little bit and think about how we actually have 12, 13,000 or longer years of very empirical, well-practiced Indigenous science and law that fostered thriving fish populations throughout every part of what is currently Alberta. And so that helps us to also kind of like deeply inform how we do our work. So we do something called moving at the speed of trust, which an activist in the US, Adrienne Marie Brown, talks about in some of her work. And so we've just been really slowly building this project since we got our initial funding in 2019. But a lot of our work, as Janelle so eloquently showed, is grounded in our lived experiences and intergenerational experiences. So for me, as a Red River Métis person, I'm informed by my experiences as a Todd with ties to Central Alberta and Lac La Biche and St. Paul des Métis and other places. But I also was really lucky to grow up with Wayne Roberts as like a family member, an adoptive, step parent in my life, and getting to see him work as a scientist and all of the scientists that he was working with and passionate land and water sort of defenders or advocates in the province deeply shaped how I do my work. And then my mom, Cheryl Croucher, who we are working with on this project as well as an environmental journalist, also, sort of exposed me as a young person to a lot of the dynamic work that we do here in Alberta. And I think something that's really important that is foundational to our work is we really want to uplift and celebrate Indigenous laws and science. And we also want to uplift and celebrate the science that non-Indigenous people are doing in Alberta, because it's really tied to place. The work that, I'm sure there's a lot of you in the room tonight who are scientists who've dedicated your lives to practicing science in Alberta. That's really important work, and it's hard work because it's a place that is not always, easy to do that work. So we're trying to build this kind of collective that is aligned with the other collectives in the province that are advocating for fish, and we want to celebrate that work. So one of the ways we're doing that is with our podcast with veteran environmental and science journalist Cheryl Croucher, who has over the last few years been interviewing some really powerful, deep thinkers. We call a lot of these folks fish philosophers, people who think deeply about fish. And we haven't officially done a hard launch of the podcast yet, but we're building up our episodes and releasing them in sort of a soft launch. And so you can go to our website, restoringbulltrout.ca, and listen to the first 5 episodes, and we have some more coming. And this is one of the ways that we're sort of sharing our work. And then another thing we're really excited about is that we're working with members of the Stoney Nakoda Nations and sort of taking their knowledge, their ethics, their protocols, that cultural monitoring work that they've been sort of teaching us through as a team. We're co-developing this into a traveling museum exhibit, which will teach Stoney Nakoda Nation stories, protocols, ethics, language, through art and story to diverse publics in the province. And the goal of that is to bring non-Indigenous Albertans into an understanding of some of those sort of teachings that were just, teased a little bit in the video that Janelle shared. So yeah, I want to make sure I don't go over my time, but I just want to say, Gananis Gomitin, thank you so much for inviting us tonight, because it's so exciting to get to share with you about some of the work we're doing, and just get to be here in the presence of a whole bunch of really brilliant fish philosophers who care so deeply about our province and care deeply about the history of fish protection. And we stand on the shoulder of giants. Some of you are in the room. I saw you. I won't embarrass you, but some of our people we really admire in the room, and your work has shaped us deeply. So thank you. I'll end there.
Oh, wow, Zoe, thank you so much. And thanks to Janelle as well. And it's so interesting to hear you say that, you were very excited to have this invitation, because I've been wanting to have you present for so long. So for me, I'm on my end, totally having this fan experience. And so to hear that you're pleased to be here I'm absolutely thrilled. So thank you so much for sharing. And so we've heard now on the knowledge aspect from Ben, and we've heard about ethics from Zoe and Janelle. And next up, we will be moving towards action. So I'll welcome Marina Craner and Leslie Peterson to present on collaborating on habitat restoration in the Wipers Creek watershed. And so Marina was born in Austria, and she spent as much time as she could outdoors from a very early age. She moved to Alberta in 2002, and we're so thrilled to have her here. With her passion for the natural environment, she soon became involved with the Ghost Watershed Alliance Society, joining the board of directors as a volunteer. In the spring of 2009, she was hired by GWAS as the executive director and has helped the organization grow significantly since then. Marina is also an active volunteer in her community and a force of nature. While she has a keen interest in natural sciences, continuously improving her knowledge through training and research, Marina believes that feeling connected to nature is crucial in order to preserve our environment. I couldn't agree more, Marina. Through her work with GWAS, she has led many walks and hikes in the Ghost Watershed and is engaging people in restoration projects. And Leslie Peterson is probably very familiar to many people on this call as well. Leslie is the Director of Conservation with Trout Unlimited Canada and is based in Calgary. Again, we are so lucky to have her. Leslie has been with Trout Unlimited Canada for 16 years, holding various positions in that time. Her current role involves overseeing and guiding the organization's conservation programming and policy development, participating in regional and national advisory panels and working groups, and sometimes getting out in the field with her crews for restoration projects. So welcome to both of you, and take it away.
Thanks, Amy. Okay, so I'm just going to jump right in. So Marina and I are talking about habitat restoration in the Wipers Creek watershed. Okay, so for those that don't know, Trout Unlimited Canada, we're a national conservation charity, and we have professional staff that work out of our Calgary and Guelph offices, as well as volunteer-based chapters across the country. The main priorities that guide our work include water quality and quantity, aquatic communities, and aquatic habitat. So in 2019, Amy already talked about this a little bit. We and several other NGO and government came together in the Native Trout Collaborative, thanks to some funding from the Canada Nature Fund for Species at Risk, administered by DFO. And the groups, the collaborative together, we've been working on assessment, planning, coordination, education, and outreach, all towards native trout recovery. And each partner has been able to leverage additional funding and bring their own experience and expertise to the table. So I'll pass it over to Marina to talk a little bit about GWAS.
Yeah, so I just wanted to give you a very quick introduction to the Ghost Watershed Alliance Society. So we are a watershed stewardship group that was started in 2002 under Alberta's Water for Life strategy. And to this day, we are largely volunteer driven. In a nutshell, what we do is to gather and share knowledge, raise awareness with the public and stakeholders and decision makers. And we work collaboratively to improve watershed health. And a big part of that is working with our partners from Trout Unlimited Canada.
So Amy touched on this, but just to show some pictures of just kind of set the stage of why we're even talking about native trout recovery. So if we look at West Slope cutthroat trout, historic adult density, if you look at this as sort of a report card, and all of these blobs are different little watersheds within the eastern slopes, specifically the Bow and Old Man, which is where West Slope cutthroat trout native range exists. So that's the historic density, and this is the current adult density. So we've seen pretty significant declines over the years. And, you know, just a reminder that these animals have been on this landscape for over 10,000 years. And really, I think it's in the last 100 or so years that we've really started to see these declines. Unfortunately, it's a sort of similar situation for bull trout. So again, Alberta's provincial fish, which would have a historic range all along the eastern slopes. And the current adult density, again, showing significant declines in numbers and range over the last several decades. So how did we get to this point? Well, there's lots of different threats that Alberta native trout face. So we've introduced a lot of those threats ourselves. Of course, there are natural limitations like temperature and other things like that. But besides that, we've changed, in some cases, water quality, the amount and the timing of flow. We've got now competition and hybridization with non-native species. We've got fragmentation from road crossings and dams. And we have entrainment and irrigation canals. And we're still suffering the impacts of historic overfishing when bull trout were considered trash fish, as we've learned. So many of these threats, they affect trout, but they're also impacting social and economic and other values as well in our water systems. But there are things we can do. So over the last several years, we've been working with other partners to address some of these habitat-related threats. And this includes things like bioengineering, building bridges and improving trails, and reconnecting habitats that have been fragmented. But it's a little bit overwhelming when you look at those fish sustainability assessments, those report cards that I showed earlier with all those red blobs. It's a bit overwhelming. And so what we do is work on priority setting. And through the collaborative, using available data and modeling and putting our waders on and getting out and looking at things, we can be strategic about setting priorities so that we can work together and really drive change on the landscape. This is sort of a shift from doing what one might call random acts of stewardship to really be really targeted. So yeah, we're trying to, I put an arrow here on the ghost watershed because that's what we're talking about today. And the ghost is interesting and important because it has both cutthroat trout and bull trout, and there are still pure cutthroat trout in that watershed. So it's kind of the last best in the Bow Basin. And here's the ghost watershed just upstream of Calgary. And within the Waiparis Creek watershed, in the ghost Waiparis watershed, we've been zeroing in on these two little unnamed tributaries that cross the Whispering Pines Bible Camp access road near the Waiparis Creek campground and public recreation area. So we did some stream crossing assessments in 2018 after Marina tipped us off to these hanging culverts, and we found bull trout and cutthroat trout below both of the crossings, but no bull trout above the stream, above the road crossing. We did some genetic analysis over the years to make sure that if we did connect these upstream and downstream of the road, that we wouldn't be putting any pure cutthroat trout at risk. And also did some eDNA sampling with the Blackfoot Confederacy, because with bull trout being so rare in these two little streams, eDNA is another sampling technique that can be used to detect rare species. And unfortunately, they did not detect any upstream of the culvert. I've also highlighted a little area here where the Waiparis Creek crosses the Forestry Trunk Road. And so these two little creeks and this area of Waiparis Creek is kind of a focal area for GWAS and TUC over the last few years.
Thank you, Leslie. So just a quick introduction to soil bioengineering. So what are we really talking about when we say bioengineering? And really what it is using live plant materials to perform an engineering function. In this case, here we are using native species that we find in the surrounding area. So when we go to a restoration site, we always look at the different species we find in the vicinity, and we are harvesting those to revegetate those areas that have seen some impacts. So why do we undertake bioengineering? Well, we want to prevent excessive amounts of sediment from ending up in the stream. Something like you see here on this photo is a designated trail and an unbridged ford, and you can see how much sediment goes into the stream there. And that's not a lot of gradient. So we have a lot of these crossings in the Ghost Watershed, and we're trying to address one at a time with bioengineering. We are establishing riparian vegetation.
Sorry.
So the Whispering Pines Bible Camp is, sorry, Leslie. The Whispering Pines gravel pit site was one of the first ones in 2019 that we worked on in collaboration with the Calgary ATV riders. They actually tipped us off on that particular site. They had done some stewardship work on the designated trail that runs right next to that particular ford. And they said, well, there are some people that are driving through the stream and you want to do something to restore that stream bank and, well, kind of encourage people to use the bridge. So we started that in September 2019 with a small group from the Calgary ATV riders to plant some willows. We harvested those willows the same day that we planted them. And we also had Trout Unlimited Canada join us. In 2020, we came back to that same site because what we had found is, on one hand, that the bridge that was in place was not wide enough for quite a few of the side-by-sides that are currently being used. And the issue was with how they approached the bridge. Some of them actually ended up going over the side of the bridge. And of course, that's not what we want. So we engaged with Alberta Environment and Parks, as they were called at the time, and their trails team helped us build this new bridge that is now wide enough for all of these wider side-by-sides. And we also, with the help of Trout Unlimited Canada, rerouted the trail further away from those wet areas right next to the stream. And as you can see, we had a really, really good turnout on that day in September 2020, and a large number of motorized users, as well as, well, really all people of all walks of life wanting to help to restore that area.
So we've done a few other stream crossing remediations in that area. So here's another example of where you have kind of a rickety, narrow, sketchy looking bridge that has a poor approach that people don't use. And so what we did is replaced that bridge with a better designed approach and more stable bridge, and then reclaimed the ford. And this is, of those two little tributaries, this is on the east tributary. And then another one where there was an undesignated trail crossing of the east tributary, and we were able to decommission that trail because it was undesignated and reclaim the ford. And the picture on the left, believe it or not, there is a creek flowing through there. There's just so much gravel that has sort of sloughed off the road that has kind of buried the creek and created a little bit of a barrier there. So also within those two little creeks and on the west tributary, we know that there were historic beaver dams in this area because you can see them when you're walking around, but you can also see them from the aerial imagery. If you look at these little places here where there likely would have been beaver dams and ponds, and there currently aren't. There's also areas where you can see the stream has become straight, which is not really natural in nature. So it's possible that as the gravel pit was developed, the stream was realigned over here rather than through the willows. So these are places, these are opportunities for us to do some restoration work. That straight area, here's what it looks like in real life on the ground. And what happens when you have a channelized area like this, the water moves very quickly, and it's kind of like a straight shot, like bowling alley. The water just kind of moves through. It's very effective conveyance, but it's okay for us to slow water down and have it held back on the landscape. When a stream is channelized like this and it becomes sort of deeper and deeper, then it eventually can't actually access its floodplain anymore. So when it floods, it continues to just erode down deeper. And as that happens, the water table drops with it. And so it effectively sort of dries out the whole valley. When we took this picture, there were fish in the stream here, just upstream. But unfortunately, this part of the creek would typically dry up every year. There are ways that we can address these issues, though, on the landscape. And so this diagram shows the process of restoration using beaver dam analogs, which is a form of restoration that's kind of based on beaver mimicry. And so you can start by having that channelized straight ditch-like area that becomes more and more complex as you add wood and complexity into the system so that it eventually can become wetted and complex with lots of habitat and water. And so here's a look at that area with the bridge that was installed that Marina talked about and the trail that was realigned and the beaver dam analogs that we installed in 2022. And the stream was dry when we did this. And building a beaver dam analog is kind of like what you would think it would be like. It's moving sticks and soil to build a dam as best we can with our human abilities. This was pretty labor intensive, but we built those 3 beaver dam analogs in a week. And in following spring, they were holding water, which was very exciting. And even into the fall, there was still water. And if you recall last fall, it was a very, very dry year. And so we were pretty excited to see that the creek was able to hold water. As we walked further upstream beyond the beaver dam analogs, we saw actual beaver dams just a few hundred meters upstream. So thankfully, we helped to kind of create the conditions that beavers could come there on their own. We're excited about this because the beavers can continue the work without us. They can do it for free and they don't require permits. And they're honestly just better at building beaver dams than we are. But if you remember, there was those hanging culverts. And we were interested in replacing those hanging culverts for fish passage. We want to be able to connect fish from upstream and downstream and be able to provide that refugia so fish can access different habitats, and also to restore stream processes. So streams convey more than water. There should be sediment and other material and wood that moves through streams as well. And when you have a road embankment in the way, those processes are interrupted. And so by creating an open bottom arch, you allow those stream processes to occur as well as fish passage, but also other wildlife, including beavers. And so I think that although we were starting to look at the process of how do we reintroduce beavers to this system, we created the conditions and they were able to do it themselves. There was 2 tributaries with hanging culverts, and in 2023, we replaced the second one with an open bottom arch as well. Before we did the work, I mentioned we had done some fisheries sampling, and last summer our crew went out with the kids from the Bible camp to do some sampling, and it was very exciting because they caught bull trout upstream of the west tributary. On the west tributary, they caught bull trout above the road for the first time, and also long-nosed dace, another native minnow species that we haven't seen there before. And next door, right upstream, is another site that we did a bunch of work, and I'll leave it to Marina to talk about this one.
Yeah, so this site is something that we had looked at for quite a while. It's right on Vipers Creek. It's just immediately upstream of the confluence with those Whispering Pines west and east tributaries. And it's right at the crossing side of the Forestry Trunk Road. There's a big bridge, and people really wanted to get to the river, but do they really have to drive down all the way? So we had those 2 access points that were highly compacted straight into that critical habitat for native trout. So we observed significant sediment runoff at the site. You can see that here on the picture. That is the west side of the bridge. And there's a little bit of a spring actually up right next to the Forestry Trunk Road, and it washed a lot of sediment straight into Vipers Creek. The site was also identified by Trout Unlimited Canada in the survey that Leslie had mentioned of crossing sites in the Coast Watershed, and it was identified as a high priority site for restoration. We worked together with Trout Unlimited Canada for on-site planning for the restoration work, and we shared a lot of the resources, including that excavator was provided by Trout Unlimited. They had it on site for the culvert replacement, and we were lucky to be able to use it on the same day to make the area rough and loose. So what I mean by rough and loose, it is a bioengineering technique that was developed by bioengineering specialist Dave Polster to treat disturbed sites. So as you can see here at the bottom, what it does is decompacting the soil. You make mounds and holes. And you can see on the picture on the right how it works once it's installed. So it looks pretty shocking at first, and we've heard from a lot of people who have come upon these sites just by accident that it looks so destructive and kind of like a moonscape. But it does decompact the soil, and it gives pioneering plants a chance to grow. So what we mean by pioneering plants are those plants that really like to colonize a site that doesn't have vegetation. And we mean native plants by that, those that occur in the vicinity. And you can see on this picture here, there's some balsam poplar. We did not plant that. It came in on its own. And there's also some willow growing in. And this is only 1 year of growth. So the benefits of the rough and loose technique are that it prevents overland flow. So that means any water that comes down the slope carrying a lot of sediment gets captured in those holes and mounds. And when you see it here in the picture going downhill, the further you go downhill, the more clear the water is. So it settles out the sediment and then infiltrates the water into the ground, prevents further erosion, even though that might be counterintuitive when you have all this roughed up soil. And it also provides diverse habitat. And what we mean by that is that the top of those mounds are rather a dry habitat, and those holes are obviously quite a wet habitat that is good for different plants than the ones that are that want to grow at the top. Next slide, please. So we did a bioengineering workshop in 2022. So that means we engaged volunteers and provided knowledge. We have our bioengineering specialist, John Burley, who is here with us today. And he provided a lot of the knowledge to our participants on how do you actually do bioengineering with native plants. So we had a planting day on October 1st. We had a classroom session with I think almost 20 people that day on October 13, and then another planting day on October 15th, because this was a rather large area to work on. So the following year, we went back in the spring, and we actually found significant survival and growth despite a very dry fall and spring in 2023. And we found, and you can see that a little bit here on that picture, that the rough and loose captured a lot of sediment that came down from the road. So here you see a comparison, and thanks so much to for the photos that John took. So before the restoration on the west side, and you can see, of course, for water, it's very easy to end up in the stream by running down that very compacted and very straight slope. And this is what it looked like just a year, well, not quite a year later, in 2023. And next slide, please. Here's the east side. You can see there was a channel forming with all of the runoff from the road. And we disrupted that with the rough and loose and the planting. We also worked on a site that is just immediately downstream of the confluence with the Whispering Pines Bible Camp, little tributary, and is right on an OHV bridge site. So this is a designated trail. Some people, for whatever reason, decided that they were driving into the stream. They actually went down the riverbed a little bit. And so we decided to talk to Alberta Parks. We got a permit to do some rough and loose and staking there. So on October 22nd of last year, we had a volunteer field day. We had one excavator, as you can see in the picture, to do some rough and loose. And we actually got about 500 willow stakes planted in those 6 hours we had on site. And really what we found is working together is the key to success. And we have been very fortunate to build relationships with many different user groups, backcountry hunters and anglers who joined us for quite a few of those restoration field days, and the Calgary ATV riders, Trails for Tomorrow. And really it's been a pleasure working with them, and many hands make for light work. So if you would like to get involved as well, we actually do have a willow harvesting workshop coming up on Saturday. Registrations open until 10 p.m. tonight. And the link for the Eventbrite page you can find in the chat.
And I'll just end by throwing up several logos of all of the different groups that have helped us with all of this work over the last several years.
Awesome. Thank you, Marina and Leslie, for all of the work that you do out there, and for sharing that with everybody tonight. And so I'll invite all of our presenters to turn on their cameras. We'll move into our question and answer period. And I did want to say before I start digging into some of these questions is that all of the presenters tonight will receive a hat from the Native Trout Collaborative. And so I'll be getting your addresses for you so that we can mail those out to you afterwards. I don't have a picture of the hat to show you, and unfortunately I don't have one myself to wear, but maybe if I present it at the next workshop, I'll get one. So we have quite a few questions, a lot of questions for Ben, but I'm going to start with a more broad question, because I had prepared some questions in case there wasn't any, and it kind of touches on a theme that I thought was important, which is collaboration. And I think all of you talked about the importance of that, whether it's getting data for temperature, whether it's, interacting with communities to share knowledge, or whether it's many hands make light work. And there was a comment in the chat box about, how do we get enough people to join forces with us so that we reach that tipping point. How can all the conservation-based associations best collaborate to effectively advocate for the collective cause? And I'll open that up to anybody that wants to start.
I'll start by saying I would encourage people to jump on any learning opportunities that are available, and workshops like Marina talked about. They've been doing workshops annually, and those are great ways to learn and connect with other practitioners. And start small and gain a little bit of confidence, and then you can work your way up.
Yeah, I guess just to add to that, really, we found that those bioengineering workshops are very popular with many, many people, whether that's students who are engaged in environmental sciences, or even professionals. You know, I mean, we had people join us who have had a long career, like 25, 30 years in engineering, dam safety and things like that. And they were still very keen on learning something new, getting engaged in those workshops, and yeah, helping us restore the area in a little bit of a different fashion than just riprap.
I'll add a little bit. I think attending workshops like these is a great starting point. I've worked on fisheries for 6 years, 7 years in Alberta, and I'm still learning new stuff through these types of meetings. The talks were wonderful, and that was great. Another way, just to put a little personal plug in there, is the Mid-Canada chapter of the American Fishery Society is slowly getting up and running again. I can post a link to the webpage in there, but we're hoping to have more community involvement that could tie into stuff like this or future workshops that get done.
Janelle or Zoe, do you have anything to add on the collaboration piece?
I don't, but I know Janelle's doing lots of really exciting work in Sundre with local community members. So I think like, yeah, like I feel like that part of like reaching out to the people around you is really important. And I don't live in Alberta anymore, but I'm learning here where I live by doing the same thing. So yeah.
I mean,
Yes, go ahead, Janelle.
I was just going to add to that and say, you know, there's so much power in that local knowledge and local interest. And I think that was it has been a large sort of influence or inspiration in our work, is to go, okay, people already know a lot. We're not going to come and tell people what to do. So like, how do we learn from people and listen to figure out how to solve these problems in a way that engages? And like, to me, that's kind of where the collaboration lies, is like, okay, so how do we, you know, figure out how to make positive change, but do it in a way that inspires people to care for the fish. So and you know, it's so much about relationships, and of course I have that advantage because I'm like related and to or grew up with more than half the people here. So they'll tell me things, but I'm just kind of kidding, but you know what I mean, that those relationships are so important, in that respect, the mutual respect.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know, like, from the cows and fish perspective, right, that's a lot of the trust that we've built in communities. We didn't go in there necessarily as outsiders to present what we thought solutions were, right? You work with the local advocates, right? And they help deliver your message for you. And I think in some cases, it's a little bit unfortunate. Sometimes, you know, we lump this into a conservation problem or issue, and it's meant for a conservation audience. But I think water is an everybody audience, right? And you don't have to be a scientist. Like, we have multiple practitioners on this call. I mean, use the gifts that you have. If you're an artist, you know, use your art to share ideas. If, you know, we use a lot of designers. I have our communications coordinator on the call tonight, and she's been so great with helping us with our communications, because sometimes scientists aren't that great at that sort of thing. So I think there's so many different ways to get involved, and I would encourage people to explore all of those, not just science. We do have a couple questions here specifically about sort of the hydrologic impacts of logging on water temperature. So I think we should dive into that one next. So there's about 2 or 3 specifically, sort of one asking, you know, the degree at which hydrologic shifts due to logging affect water temperatures. And then with that, a bit of information on whether or not things like riparian buffers and different practices will vary the impact on stream temperature. So Ben, I think that's for you.
Yeah, super complicated question. Yeah, riparian habitat does play an important role in buffering water temperature, as well as providing habitat for fish and aquatic invertebrates and terrestrial invertebrates that fish feed on. I wouldn't say I'm an expert on exactly what the buffer width is needed. And some of the work that we're doing hopefully can move to a point where we have multiple years worth of data where we could start answering some of those questions. Yeah, so I know it's a hot topic. and riparian habitat is important for fish in cold water. But yeah, I wouldn't say I'm an expert in exactly the distance that's needed. So hope that helped a bit.
Yeah, and in our next session, at the in-person session, we will have a presentation specifically looking at the impacts of forests on fish. So if you haven't already gotten a ticket, like I said, there's only like 3 left, I think. So you better be quick about it. But Dr. Kim Green and Ryan McDonald will be presenting on that.
Yeah, and those two will have some great feedback on it. Dr. Aldous Salins is another person who spent a lot of time researching the impacts of timber harvest, and I default to those individuals for their feedback on it. Yeah.
So question next for Marina and Leslie, I believe. And this one a little bit on the impact of beaver dams on fish passage. So are there concerns with fish not being able to bypass beaver dams and imitation beaver dams?
Yes and no. So there's a saying that beavers taught fish how to jump. They evolved together, and the beauty is that during high water flows in the spring, when spring spawning fish are moving around, they can typically navigate beaver dams. And there's some really cool research that's come out of the States recently, looking at, I think it might have been coho passage on beaver dam analogs, and showed that it really wasn't a problem. They were able to navigate passing through those dams. I guess there's always nuance to that, and there's certainly dams that might be temporary barriers, but they aren't forever, not like a concrete structure. So it depends. They do help create water or put water on the landscape, and fish do need water.
It depends. See, that's a typical ecologist answer, Leslie. So very well done. So next question from David, and I'm assuming this is for Ben, but I guess this could probably really apply to anybody. How will this data influence Alberta fishing regulations?
Can you read that one again?
How will the data influence Alberta fishing regulations? And I think it's asked earlier on, so I'm assuming that was regarding temperature data, but I guess that could also apply to any of the other stuff that people talked about, like the eDNA or.
Yeah, I guess I hadn't thought explicitly about regulations, and I'm no longer within fisheries management, so I don't set regulations. But some ways that the data could potentially help regulations is if certain areas are identified as critical, maybe they receive additional protection. I know that there's been talk and work associated with hoot owl regulations, and maybe that might help influence how and when and where those data are used, having raw empirical data to base it off of this past trends.
Yeah, and in follow-up to that, Ben, are these temperature optimums being applied with Alberta Environment and Protected Areas fishery staff in prioritizing watersheds, including combined with the GEO modeling for the Native Trout collaborative work?
Yeah, and so this some information was already brought in. This is going to provide higher quality, higher resolution data on water temperature within those systems. I think prior to this, they were relying heavily on air temperature. And as I talked about earlier on, it isn't as effective when you care about smaller areas, especially ones that have groundwater input or other cold water sources like glaciers. The models tend to fall apart when you purely rely on air temperature in those scenarios. So yes, I think it would help inform and improve. And I sincerely hope that managers and practitioners on the landscape use this in decision making for cold water habitat whenever they're working in or out.
And another question for Leslie and Marina regarding signage for techniques like rough and loose. Are you putting information out there to educate the public on these techniques that sometimes look very aggressive on the landscape?
So far, we've mostly done that through presentations in many, many different forms like this one. We haven't done any signage particular to rough and loose yet, but we have talked to Alberta Parks about it to put some up at the Vipers Creek public recreation area, and hopefully it will spread from there.
Thank you. Well, it looks like we only have about a minute left. So I want to touch on a comment slash question in here, and it's a big one from David. And so I'll just read his comment and then question, and I'll allow any one of you to jump in if you'd like. David says, we can tell stories about the way we used to catch fish, remember when, but we can also tell stories about what we bequest to the future. How will we become good ancestors? And so is there any piece of advice that anyone here would offer on how we become a good ancestor?
I just want to say that I love the question. I really appreciate it. Makes me happy. And maybe that's what we just all really need to do, is ask ourselves that question. You know, do we need to answer it directly? I'm not sure if we just think in those terms.
Yeah, so I wanted to make sure it got read out loud, because I think it is something that is worthwhile for everybody to ponder and be concerned about.
Yeah, and I think Dr. Leroy Littlebear reminds us that fish have survived every mass extinction on the planet, but if we look at the data today, fish are not doing okay throughout the whole planet. And so that kind of thinking about fish have the capacity, fish have been very good ancestors to us. Are we going to be very good ancestors to them? And I think that's sort of something that is sort of provocative for us to all carry as well.
Wow, thanks so much for that, Zoe. And I think unless any of the other presenters have anything they want to add, and you can do so while I get either Maddie or Logan to put up the closing poll for us. So while we have folks still on the call, pardon me, if you could please go ahead and answer the poll that's going to pop up on your screen. Make sure you look at both questions. The first being, did you learn something new today? And I really hope that you did. And the second, will this workshop impact the way you impact or interact with native trout and their habitat? And so before we close up tonight, I will also say that we'll also be sending around a recording of this session. And we'll send around some helpful links that were mentioned in the chat throughout the session as well. So if you missed something or you had some issues with your sound, you will have that in your inbox. And I want to give a final thank you again to all of our presenters, Marina, Leslie, Janelle, Ben, and Zoe, and an extra special thank you to the helpers. They're not visible on screen here, but Maddie and Logan for taking care of all the technical stuff in the background. And again, thank you to our funders. And I will see some of you next week at the in-person session at Chain Lakes. So until then, good night and have a good week.